Welcome everyone to another webinar. Good to have everyone joining today. As I'm sure you all know from the title, we're going to be talking about the Omnibus Proposal, kind of the elephant in the room now for the last 3 months or so. And we're going to be taking you through all of the details that we've gathered over this time and be telling you a bit more about the expertise we've gathered, the people we've spoken to, including members of the European Parliament, policymakers, and practitioners. We'll be taking you through kind of the insights on the practical side of things, but we'll also be showing you a bit about the process surrounding the Omnibus Proposal, which means that we'll kind of tell you about what the European Parliament is doing as of now, how a proposal usually goes through Parliament, and what to look out for. And then, of course, we'll also have the 6 steps, which are very practical and oriented towards helping everyone work towards ESG success. Also in a landscape where the kind of the main driver is no longer reporting mandatorily, but reporting for market-driven incentives or for other reasons as well. We usually always wait 1 or 2 minutes to let people come in, as I also know that from my own experiences, I usually tend to arrive 1 or 2 minutes late to these webinars. I see that now everyone's trickling in, so I think we can get started. Quick introduction from myself. I'm Jasper. I'm one of the sustainability researchers here at Coolset, which means that I've been spending the last 2 years or so working on CSRD, EU taxonomy, VSME, just kind of the whole bunch of legislative reporting standards in the European Union, and been making sure that these are ready for our customers to use within a software environment. So I've kind of gained experience there. And then, of course, since the Omnibus Proposal, have been focusing a lot on how to help our customers to navigate those changes and to get the most out of those changes as well. I have with me Freddie. She's one of our sustainability researchers as well. And together we'll be telling you all about the Omnibus Proposal. Please feel free to put all of your questions in the chat function or in the question box on your bottom right. We'll have a Q&A towards the end of today's webinar, wherein we'll try and answer all of your questions. Should there be too many questions for the time we have, we'll be sure to get back to you over email. So any question you ask will be answered. I think without further ado, we can get started. Let me hand it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Jasper. Cool, yeah. So I'll just lay out the agenda and the plan for today. We're going to start by outlining what the Omnibus is and just giving you the facts again of what it means for companies. Jasper will then take over and talk about what's happening inside Brussels in terms of the policy side and the legislation. And then we'll give you the path forward in 6 clear steps. So some really clear, useful steps that you can implement within your company to keep up with ESG reporting. And finally, we'll be doing a live audience Q&A. So yeah, as Jasper said, feel free to put any questions in the chat whilst we're doing this webinar, and we'll be sure to get back to them at the end. Cool. We're just going to start off with a poll just to understand kind of who's in the audience and what you want to get from this webinar and how we can best serve you. So just like to know which of the following best describes your organization. Are you maybe a company interested in ESG reporting, a public sector entity, someone else? So maybe just drop your vote below. Cool. I can see lots of people are advisors of ESG reporting or service providers. Nice. And the next poll question we've got is, are you going to continue reporting on ESG after Omnibus? Maybe you have to and your company remains in scope, or you're uncertain where the future lies, so you want to continue reporting just in case. Maybe you're reporting on something else, not your original CSRD, or you've given up completely. Cool, can see lots of votes coming in. Nice, we've got about a quarter of you saying you're going to continue reporting and uncertain whether future lies. About 20% are continuing reporting to maintain credibility. About 5%, 12% saying you're not going to continue reporting at all. So we'll see. Great. And finally, if you're exempt from the mandatory reporting, what is the biggest challenge you're facing right now? Maybe it's uncertainty and you're unsure whether to focus your efforts and where to focus them. You've got some internal disagreements, you're struggling to maintain your ESG budget, or you've got a lack of external motivation and your stakeholder pressures have changed. 57% are saying uncertainty, 66 even, and then about equal on the internal disagreements and change stakeholder pressures. Really interesting. Yeah, about 70% of you saying uncertainty is a big challenge you're facing. Great, thanks everyone. Cool, so we'll just start with outlining the Omnibus facts again. Just a quick recap. The Omnibus itself is a 67-page document. It was published in February early this year, and it was a piece of legislative tool, a legislative tool used by the EU to publish a lot of changes to different legislations, all under one piece of legislation. So in essence, it's the European Commission's push to simplify sustainability regulations. It's included major rollbacks to CSRD, EU taxonomy, and CSRD. And it was framed by the EU as a competitiveness measure, citing namely Mario Draghi's 2024 report on EU competitiveness, which argues that the EU no longer has the regulatory framework to support competitiveness and resilience. But this has been widely criticized, not only because it also, this kind of deregulation and rollback of regulations on sustainability undermine the EU's ambitions to become net zero by 2050. The Omnibus was also accompanied by the Stop the Clock Directive, which was voted in with a majority, which has allowed for some delays in the reporting under these regulations. So for CSRD, for the Wave 2 companies, they've been allowed 2 years to pause on the reporting. Cool. And focusing in on the CSRD specifically, I'll just touch on a few topics which the Omnibus has changed and how this impacts companies, both in terms of scope and data points as well. So previously, the CSRD was going to be applicable to all companies with over 250 employees with a phased date for compliance. And the proposed change suggests that it will only be applicable to those with over 1,000 employees, with some reports even suggesting that this could go up to 3,000 or even 5,000 employees. So that is very much still in debate. The CSRD companies covered, therefore, will reduce from around 50,000 to just under 7,000. So a significant reduction in those who have to report on CSRD. In terms of the value chain, we'll see a change from all companies within a value chain having to supply data to the CSRD reporting company. And this will change to only those who are also subject to CSRD having to provide this data. But what we've seen from big industry players such as H&M and Philips is that they're going to continue requesting ESG data from all suppliers within their value chain. So it's suggesting that a lot of this isn't going to change in practice. And finally, double materiality is a topic that is set to be changed. Jasper had a conversation with Wim Bartels, who is on the Sustainability Reporting Board of EFRAG, and he has been suggesting that double materiality, in fact, is going to be streamlined. A lot of the reports were kind of implying that it would remain untouched, but actually it's likely that the double materiality assessment itself will also be streamlined and reduced. Cool. I'll now pass over to Jasper, who'll run you through the political process.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, so I think most of us have been keeping up to date more or less with the Omnibus proposal. If not, that's also completely fine. That's what you're here for today. But for those that have kept up just a bit even, you'll know that there's kind of a lot of happening. There's a lot of turbulence. There's a lot of kind of noise surrounding everything. So to see through that and to know what's really going on can be quite tricky at times. So what we're going to try to do today is just kind of break it down for you, mention who the big players are right now in Brussels and how they're influencing the process, so that it also helps you understand where this all might go. So just to give a bit of an explanation of how a legislative proposal usually goes through kind of the chambers of the European Union, there's three main institutions that are relevant for this process in Brussels. That's the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union. The process begins with the European Commission, of which Ursula von der Leyen is the president. Some of you may know her. And usually a process of kind of drafting such a legislative proposal, in this case, the Omnibus Proposal, takes quite a while. But from the moment that the Omnibus Proposal was first mentioned to the moment that it was published on the 26th of February, it only took 4 months, which is really, really fast for such a proposal. And that also raises a lot of questions on the integrity of the report, on kind of the due diligence that was done to ensure that it's complying with all of the regulations and kind of the checks and balances within the European Union. But more about that in a second. So just to kind of give you a brief rundown, the Commission then kind of sends it on to the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union for them to discuss. And right now we're kind of in this stage here. So the European Parliament is now discussing it, and the European Parliament is also where the political process happens. So there's 720 seats, and every seat is occupied by a member of the European Parliament that is voted by kind of the national representatives. And I'll give you a bit of a breakdown about that in a second, which parties represent what interests and so forth, because this is really where, there's kind of the opportunity to still change the Omnibus Proposal. Because that also might be good to note is the proposal is just that, it's a proposal, it's not final. There still might be quite some amendments being made in the meantime, which is dependent on the kind of majority in the parliament and how that majority shapes these amendments and gets them pushed through. So once that goes through, it goes to the council, which then kind of gives its go ahead. And this is all part of what is often called the trilogue negotiations, which is basically where the Commission, Parliament, and Council come together to agree on the process going forward. And this trilogue negotiation also happens to avoid having to go through this very tedious process of having a second or even a third reading, where you have to kind of go through these steps again if it turns out that the Council doesn't approve. So once that's all kind of discussed, the European Parliament adopts it. It is then endorsed by the Council if all goes well, and it is then sent on to lawyers to ensure that it's compliant with the European law, but it's also sent to linguists, which translate the proposal into the 24 official European languages so that it can be read by everyone in the EU. The presidents of the Commission and the European Parliament then sign this proposal, or at that point it's not a proposal anymore, actually it's accepted. And the very last step is more of a formality, but it's basically the publication in the official journal. So this is, it does look like a journal. It's a very dry journal. It basically contains all the legislative publications that are rolled out by the European Union. And as soon as you see something in that journal, that essentially means that it's past the last step, and it is then transposed or should be transposed into national law. So that's the process, more or less. Now, what we're seeing in Brussels is that there's kind of a pro-European majority, but there's also a very strong deregulatory minority that's pushing for deregulation even further of what we're seeing today with the Omnibus Proposal, which means that there's a strong push and pull happening between simplification, but also ambition on the other side. The deregulation camp is pushing to scale back sustainability laws, whereas the pro-European bloc is working to hold ground. And that's kind of creating this very interesting dynamic in the European Parliament that we're going to go zoom into in a second. because on the one hand, there's political will for agreement. There's a lot of political pressure on the omnibus proposal, and parties want to move on. But on the other hand, these positions are very polarized. So you have some kind of far-right parties that are very adamant about watering down regulations, scrapping all regulations. I mean, I'm sure some of you might have seen kind of the symbolic chainsaw that was first kind of used by the Argentinian president, and is now also has been mentioned in actually debates on the omnibus proposal. Some far-right politicians have talked about using a chainsaw to go through all of the sustainability laws. So it kind of shows that there is a lot of discussion on this. And I think what's interesting here is also that it's still, regardless of all these polarization issues, we're still expecting to see a final kind of decision on the omnibus by late 2025, which is really quickly, considering that the proposal was first published on the 26th of February. Usually these processes can take up to 2 years. So it's really kind of a fast-paced process. And if all the checks and balances are considered, then fine. But as I will mention in a second, there are some kind of questions to be raised by watchdogs based in Brussels, but also by just people like you and me that might find that some of these things are not done according to the ways you would expect them to be done in Brussels. Which is also one of our takeaways towards the end of the webinar, is reach out to your members of European Parliament and make sure that your concerns are heard. So the European Parliament has actually formed already a majority that's working together on the omnibus proposal. So I think that's an interesting development. It's also meaning that things are moving, and I think it's quite a positive coalition for those that think that the omnibus proposal is kind of bad for the sustainability landscape in Europe. So the coalition is formed by the European People's Party, the Socialists and Democrats, Renew Europe, and the Green Party. So it's kind of a center coalition. The EPP and Renew, I would say, are somewhat center-right, whereas S&D and the Greens are more on the left side. But together, I think they sit somewhere in the center. And they hold a clear majority of 454 out of 720 seats. And they seek to balance simplification with preserving ESG integrity, which means I think that we're not going to see a very strong shift away from the current omnibus proposal, but we're also not going to see further watering down, which is also still a risk, considering that a lot of parties, or actually not that many, but they're quite vocal, so they like to make their voices heard, that they want to water it down even further. These parties that form the coalition are united by their concern that deals with the far right would harm the EU in the short, but also in the long run. So for now, this is a majority that is holding. In my interview with an MEP, she also mentioned that this is something that's holding for now, and hopefully will hold until the end of this process. But it is something that is still to be seen. So this is not definite yet. What I think is interesting is to kind of take you through the individual parties and to show you what they're saying and how their stances are being formulated. Beginning with the biggest party, the European People's Party. They have 188 seats in the European Parliament and are therefore also the biggest party. And what's interesting is that they're center-right, so they could work with left-wing parties, but they could also work with right-wing parties. For them, both is possible. So that's also the parties that they work with kind of shape how this narrative is going to be formed in the future. So on the one hand, they push for simplification to reduce reporting burdens and boost competitiveness, and that's kind of really their central stance in this. And as I mentioned, because they're the biggest and they're kind of in the center, they are very central to this four-party pro-European coalition, because any coalition that is formed will include the EPP. They do back the raising of CSRD thresholds, such as, for example, raising the turnover threshold from 50 million euros to 450 million euros. But they also face internal pressure to go further on ESG deregulation. So they face that from kind of the other parties that they're not forming a coalition with, but of course also from a lot of lobby organizations that have, throughout this whole omnibus proposal and preceding it as well, had a very strong voice in this matter, which is concerning in itself. but as it stands today, they still have a lot of influence in Brussels. I also have a quote for every party that I've taken from the omnibus debate that occurred on March 10th. And I think these quotes also kind of signal where these parties stand in terms of omnibus. So as Thomas Tobbe said from the EPP, the big debate now is, will you stand for growth and jobs or red tape and bureaucracy? I think that's a very clear stance in this matter. So for them, the omnibus proposal is really just red tape and bureaucracy, essentially meaning that they want to slash it. So that's kind of something to consider. Moving on to the second biggest party in the coalition, which is the Socialists and Democrats. They have 136 seats, and they are defenders of strong social and environmental standards in ESG laws. They oppose excessive exemptions that weaken corporate accountability, and they support maintaining CSRD climate and due diligence obligations. They also seek compromises that preserve the Green Deal's core goals, which is, I think, something interesting to note here, because the EU Green Deal, which is still very much on kind of something that the European Union is aiming for, wants the EU to be net zero in 2050. So achieving that will require, of course, hard data, but also kind of the efforts of all the companies and businesses within the European Union to be part of that decarbonization effort. And they're also mentioning that, well, if you want them to decarbonize, if you want them to be competitive in the sustainability space, we need to hold them accountable, and we need to kind of incentivize them to start reporting on sustainability, but also to work towards choosing more sustainable alternatives. And there, of course, the CSRD, but also the CSRD and EU taxonomy and other frameworks come into play. So here a quote that is from Lara Wolters. This is not simplification, it's obstructing justice. Removing liability for child labor and deforestation isn't streamlining, it's erasing accountability. So here you also see a very clear stance of the SND, which is much more kind of pro-regulation in order to ensure that the externalities of businesses are kind of internalized in terms of the environmental sense, but also I think in this example, much more in the social sense, so that the child labor and deforestation issues are also accounted for. Renew Europe is the third party in the coalition. They have 77 seats, and they're a bit more conservative. So they've said that they focus more on practical implementation and support moderate simplification without undermining core ESG goals. So they advocate aligning CSRD, CSRD, and taxonomy frameworks in terms of the frameworks themselves. So they want to simplify them and bring them together, or they're closer together. But they also talk about these thresholds that they want to bring closer together. They also emphasize legal clarity to support businesses and investor confidence. So they just want to kind of streamline the whole process, make it simpler, make it more clear, which I think in itself is a very good ambition, as I also have been guilty of being confused by these policy documents that have been very extensive, very complicated to understand. So I think there's definitely something to be won by simplifying certain texts and kind of increasing legal clarity there. So here a quote from Svenja Hahn: "We need all kinds of new omnibuses. And the next one must be a digital omnibus because we need to simplify the excessive digital laws." So here you see that they're all about kind of streamlining laws, making them simple. And it also shows that the omnibus, which we're seeing today, the omnibus proposal, is not an exclusive kind of term only used for the sustainability regulations, but it is something that we might see more of in the future for also other kind of domains, such as the digitalization in the European Union. Last but not least, we have the Green Party. And here I think it's interesting as well, because the Green Party, it wasn't necessary for an absolute majority, while neither was Renew if the Greens were part of it. So the fact that these four still decided to work together, really shows that also beyond just forming an absolute majority, they also have some kind of benefit of working together. Well, I think it's already in the name, but the European Greens are the strongest defenders of ambitious climate and due diligence rules. They're critical of the omnibus as a potential vehicle for deregulation and support simplification only if it doesn't weaken ESG impact. So I think they're kind of very much on the train that says, well, we want to simplify. We want to simplify like kind of the way it's presented. We want to simplify certain data points, but we don't want the core of the ESG ambitions to water down. Here a quote from Marie Toussaint: is you're not reducing bureaucracy, you're extending impunity. This isn't simplification, it's sabotage. So here it's very clear language on the process that is currently happening and also on their stance in this. So I think especially, the EPP and the Green Party, they're going to be somewhat further apart in this whole process, which is also why it's important that they stick together throughout, but also means that, they might reach a breaking point where the EPP proposes perhaps a higher threshold. The Greens cannot, in good conscience, agree, and that might lead to a certain outcome which is not favorable. But for now, it is working. But in what shape or form, we're yet to find out. So a while back, I interviewed the vice president of the European Greens, Kira Marie Peter Hansen. I think she mentioned a couple of things which I thought were really interesting, also gave me a bit of a look behind the scenes. So I thought I would share them here as well. She is also the shadow rapporteur in Jury, which is the Commission for Legal Affairs, and coordinates the Greens across all committees. So what she also mentioned to me is that the Commission should have used Level 2 Act instead of reopening legislation. A Level 2 Act is essentially a way for the Commission to make adaptations to existing directives without having to kind of break it all open and come up with a new proposal, which we're seeing now with the Omnibus Proposal. So she mentions that we could have definitely saved a lot of taxpayer money, saved a lot of hours in undone work, saved a lot of headache and confusion with reporting companies that now don't know what to do if the Level 2 Act would have been utilized. She also has a couple of red lines, which include the CSRD scope. So she's really adamant about protecting that scope. Either bringing it down from 1,000 or keeping it there, perhaps. That's going to be really, really tough for the whole coalition together to focus on or to find a agreement on. She also mentioned that the Greens focus on value chain depth, so showing that it's not just tier 1 suppliers that are being assessed within CSRD, but also the whole value chain in itself. And she also mentioned that civil liability provisions are really important. So under CSRD, companies or individuals may kind of go to court if they have suffered damages from, for example, environmental pollution or certain kind of social risks that are linked to companies. Under the Omnibus Proposal, those provisions would be removed. So it's really important here also to ensure that from the Green Party's perspective, these are maintained. She criticized the lacking impact assessment. So, within those 4 months, they weren't really able to do an impact assessment on what the implications are, the rush process in itself, but also the legal instability for businesses going forward the next couple of months. She also notes that, pretty interestingly, Sweden has a very big influence in this whole process, but that's mainly because of the members of European Parliament that have a say in this. So, for example, the lead rapporteur, which is part of the Committee of Legal Affairs, is Swedish. The ENVI rapporteur, which is the Committee of Environmental Matters, is Swedish, and a key EPP vice president is also Swedish. So that kind of shows, that if there's a change of tone in Sweden, that might also have an effect on how the Omnibus Proposal is shaped. And I think it's also kind of interesting if you zoom out. Negotiation teams include a Swede, a Dane, a Dutch, and a French MEP. And they urge companies to continue efforts towards green towards the green transition, as it's a long-term certainty. There's also a process failure. So the EU Ombudsman complaint was filed. So business associations' demands were incorporated almost verbatim. Most companies consulted came from just 5 countries: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. And only 15% of consulted companies were small to medium enterprises, while they actually make up 99% of the European businesses. So that kind of shows that the stakeholders involved were very skewed. The entire proposal was drafted and adopted in under 4 months, which is highly unusual for legislation of this scale. Now we have another poll question that I would like to briefly share with you. It's the last question or the last poll question of this webinar. Here we go. What is your organization's perspective on the EU Omnibus Proposal? It simplifies reporting and reduces administrative burdens. It undermines progress in corporate sustainability. We're still assessing its implications. It has minimal impact on our sustainability initiatives. You can also select one option. So just decide what's most relevant for you. So I see that most of you are saying it undermines progress in corporate sustainability, with around 50% mentioning it. And a couple of you are saying that you're still assessing the implications. Around 17% are saying it simplifies reporting and reduces administrative burdens. And one person has said it has a minimal impact on our sustainability initiatives. So now I'll give it back to Freddie, who will talk about what to do now in terms of these 6 steps.
Thanks, Jasper. Cool. Yeah. As Jasper said, I'm now going to talk you through 6 really practical steps which will help you prepare for ESG reporting in this kind of uncertain landscape that we're in right now. So we'll start with step 1, which is clarifying your regulatory position and acting accordingly. So what we suggest here is kind of reviewing both your company's requirements under the current and the proposed scope of EU sustainability laws. So doing this for each of the laws, both CSRD, CSRD, EU taxonomy, and also looking into the new voluntary SME reporting regulations. And, seeing how it changes and what changes from the old and the new scope. This will help you identify your position and where you fall under these laws, whether you're in scope of all of them, maybe you're in a grey zone, or you're exempt under the omnibus. It's really important here to remember that you shouldn't stop generating ESG data altogether just because the regulations hit a pause or you might not have to do it legally anymore. It doesn't mean that ESG data isn't important, and it's really important to stakeholders. A lot of investors are requiring ESG data, again, kind of up and down the value chain, ESG data is required. So keep reporting and keep generating this data. Step 2 is to build a lean and adaptable reporting system. So use this pause to your advantage. A lot of you will be benefiting from a 2-year pause in required reporting. So this can actually be really helpful in fixing up your internal processes and systems, kind of looking at those inefficiencies and where you have gaps in your data, or maybe your data isn't standardized, and you can kind of use this time to work out how to make sure everything is in the same format and you have a really slick and smooth process to get that data into your systems. Also creating clear audit trails and setting up your own internal reporting logic. So what's really helpful here is kind of softwares, tools and platforms that change with the regulations. So the softwares that will allow you to kind of increase your scope if the regulation requires you to do so, or decrease your scope if that's how you choose to move on. So rather than kind of being stuck in spreadsheets and Excel, utilize these tools that can help you be more flexible with all this uncertainty. Cool. And step 3 is preparing for a 2025 disclosure dry run. So kind of a two-phase plan for the rest of the year, and recommending that in Q3 you kind of focus on this core data infrastructure. So collecting the data that's here to stay and is really useful and informative. I know I touched on the double materiality assessment maybe being streamlined. That's not confirmed yet, but it remains a really important part of identifying your impacts. So, performing a double materiality assessment or collecting your ESRS general disclosures. These are kind of here to stay. They're not going to be touched on. They're really important in ESG reporting. And starting to think about collecting scope 1 to 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So understanding where your emissions lie, and this is all data that can be used later on. And I saw a question asking about this, but kind of in October, EFRAG is expected to publish updated ESRS data point guidance, with this draft being released in July. But by October, it should be confirmed about what the new ESRS data points will look like. There's a kind of expectation that this will be a 30 to 50% reduction. But again, we're not sure, and we'll see as the time comes. And then by Q4, we should have more clarity on what these new ESRS data points look like. And so this could be a good time for you to simulate a full ESRS disclosure, kind of testing that muscle, internal logic, seeing how it can work, collecting data within teams and from suppliers. So mapping to the new ESRS data points in Q4. Step 4 is developing a fully funded climate transition plan. So, the regulatory landscape might be changing, but it doesn't mean that a climate transition plan isn't important. It's especially important if we're kind of aiming for this net zero by 2050 under the EU Green Deal. And it's also really important in the wider corporate landscape with stakeholders, investors, clients, like people are invested in a climate transition. So using SBTI to define science-based targets which you can achieve. And in doing so, mapping your emission hotspots. So working out where your biggest emission producers are, whether that's in a particular location or a particular process within your supply chain, and kind of pulling those reduction levers that can have the greatest impact. And when making this climate transition plan, it's important to kind of include those concrete implementation steps. So assigning responsibility and accountability to particular individuals, linking the plan to internal budgets, and that really makes sure you stay on track and execute the plan rather than just being a paper exercise. Step 5 is creating cross-department buy-in around materiality. So just because the reporting landscape is changing and uncertain doesn't mean that ESG should be siloed. Here, it's really important to revisit those materiality assessments and understand really where your biggest impacts are, whether that's the biggest impact you have on the environment or kind of what risks climate change poses to you and in terms of your financial materiality. And really understanding those and having some data to support it can help you include ESG in your business strategy. We had a discussion yesterday with the Coolset Future 15 winners, and one of them was talking about what's really important as a sustainability manager today is being able to bring your whole team along with your sustainability journey. So really bringing those C-suite and executive members along with your ESG plans and commitments. So yeah, aligning all teams within a company on your strategy and messaging and where you're going to focus. And finally, as Jasper mentioned, we still have the chance to influence the outcome. So connecting with your country's representation in the EU, reaching out to MEPs in relevant committees, particularly those with the greater influence, so the rapporteur and the vice rapporteur, coordinating through national business associations or EU-level coalitions, working with other businesses to show your support, and joining consultations and sharing feedback. So really sharing what the Omnibus means to you as a business and how it's impacted you and how you want it to look. And finally, monitoring progress, so keeping up to date with these changes, whether that's through a software supporting these changes, or it's keeping up with newsletters, or in discussions in LinkedIn and with wider people. So yeah, the next steps and how to get ahead within this kind of landscape of uncertainty. I think what's been really clear in discussions we've had and stuff we've been reading is that ESG is here to stay, and it's really important not to give up now. So assume that CSRD and CSDD are delayed, but not cancelled, because they're still upcoming. And for a lot of you, you'll be required to report under them. And if not mandatorily, kind of voluntarily, it's really important to align with ESRS. This will give you a really good overview of your ESG data and will allow you to kind of get ahead when these regulations come back into force. Using this pause strategically to improve long-term competitiveness is also important. As I mentioned, kind of getting your data and your systems intact to be able to be more efficient in the future. Protecting your stakeholder trust is really important here. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding ESG right now, and a lot of stakeholders who rely on there being an ESG policy and climate transition plans being in place. So communicate openly with them and engage with them annually. So maybe, keep touch base and keep sharing what you're doing, and don't just suddenly drop any ESG commitments. And finally, staying connected to the regulatory process. So something we find really useful is the responsible investor, or following key figures on LinkedIn who are very well connected to the what's going on in terms of the EU Omnibus and other kind of changes. Andreas Rascher on LinkedIn is particularly helpful, we find. And yeah, it's something really important to note is that we did a survey of companies, and we've found that 90% of companies are still planning to continue reporting with ESG, even if it's no longer a hard legal requirement. So the smart companies are kind of carrying on with this reporting, and it'll help you get ahead in the long run. Cool. Now I'll pass over to Jasper, who'll just do a brief talk on solutions.
Perfect. Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, so I'll just go over it in 1 to 2 minutes, mention how we can kind of support in this process, and then we'll go to the Q&A. I've seen some really interesting questions come in, so I'm looking forward to answering those. So Coolset was founded in 2021, and we specialize in supporting mid-market enterprises that have limited sustainability-related capacity and a preference for building long-term internal know-how. That means that we support clients from A to Z across their sustainability compliance journey, which means that we have 2 modules. We have compliance management and we have carbon management. So let me break that down here quickly. So our compliance management module focuses on, for example, CSRD, VSME, EU taxonomy, and our carbon management module focuses on scope 1 to 3 calculations in line with TÜV Rheinland certified methodologies. Our Coolset base kind of brings it all together, which means that we have analytics platforms, which kind of visualize the data you import into your scope 1, 2, and 3 assessment, but also into your ESG data. We have automations that kind of bring it all together. We have collaborative functions that allow you to seamlessly work together with your teams. And we have, of course, also the function to improve kind of the usability of the platform for your auditor. So you can bring it all into one place. We also have an audit trail so that the auditor can always see who edited the last question, but you can also assign questions to, for example, the auditor. So you can fast track your CSRD compliance and pass audits with confidence with pre-built workflows for double materiality and ESRS disclosures. You can collect supporting evidence and maintain a complete audit trail and generate audit-ready reports. Of course, we all know that the ESRS is being heavily revisited. I think that's also kind of a benefit of a software solution, is that we are very much on top of it. And as soon as these updates roll out somewhere in the end of October or beginning of November, we're going to instantly get on it and make sure that all of these updates are reflected in the platform as soon as possible. So that's kind of an assurance you have as well, is that whatever updates are rolled out, we will always deliver those updates to our customers as soon as possible. We also navigate through the process without losing detail, so we maintain nuance. You get highlighted source references to the original framework, depending on the question, and you get dynamic conditions which guide you through your workflow and answer only what's required and nothing more. We're built for collaboration across departments, which means that you can invite unlimited users and centralize your compliance workflows in one place. You can assign teams to questions as an assignee, reviewer, or an auditor, and you can tag users, leave comments, and bring communication to where reporting happens. So we do this for customers that report on, for example, CSRD or VSME, but we also have a module that we have provided for consultants, which is called Coolset for Consultants. If you want to know more about that, feel free to reach out. And now we're happy to kind of sit together and see how we can support you in that. You can also support evidence and create transparent audit trails, which allows you basically to, just refer to documentation and to assign certain auditors. I hope that was quick enough. I tried to keep these very short and just put all the value in the webinar itself. Many thanks for joining. Let's now have a look at the Q&A. I saw some questions coming in, so I'll just kind of put them on the screen as we go and answer them to the best of my ability. So we have a question here from Nina. The simplified draft of the ESRS standard is expected on July 1st. As fellow consultants, what do you think? In what direction will the simplification of the ESRS standard go without compromising goals of the Green Deal? I think it's a really good question. So I had a conversation with Wim Bartels, who's part of the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Board. And yeah, they are kind of on the executive side of things, and of course also have to wait for what the European Parliament says. I do think that they're going to remove quite a lot of qualitative data points, and that they're going to focus really on quantitative data points. I've also heard kind of rumors that they're going to, or that they're proposing of removing the data points to the number of 100. So where it used to be 1100, they want to move it to 100. I don't think that's going to happen. What I think is it's a kind of a strategy. You know, you say an extreme number, and then you meet somewhere in the middle. But I do think that it's looking like it will be streamlined quite a bit. I think that's also good to an extent. I remember looking at some ESRS data points back when it was in the pre-omnibus days, and also being sometimes quite confused by them initially, which means that if someone that spends a lot of time in it is confused, then someone who just wants to report on it will definitely have a hard time. So I think there is a lot to say about streamlining this. Question from Christina. Does anyone know what kind of adaptation towards the omnibus that have been done in different kinds of CSRD tools, etc.? If I understand the question correctly, so what we do in, for example, our CSRD tool with regards to omnibus is we're always kind of keeping track of the changes. Before omnibus, the CSRD was also changed quite a few times from draft version to final version to kind of making amendments. And whenever those amendments came out, we always reflected those changes in the platform as soon as possible. So I hope that answers your question. Question from Hannah. Could you repeat who was the source to the statement about double materiality to be streamlined and most likely simplified? Yeah, that was Wim Bartels. He is, as I mentioned, part of the sustainability reporting board at EFRAG. I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago. We also will be sending you, after this webinar, an email with links to some interesting sources and articles, including the article that we wrote or the interview that we did with Wim. And there you also find the section on the double materiality being streamlined. So feel free to also maybe just Google it, Wim Bartels interview Coolset, perhaps. I think you should be able to find it then. But we'll also be sharing it with you after this webinar over email. I see one last question here from Mackenzie. What are the implications of the process failure filing? So I think this is a rather complex question that I'm actually looking into these days. I haven't spent too much time on it, so I'm afraid I cannot give you more of an answer than what you already know. But essentially, as far as I know at this point, the process failure filing is something that used to be mandatory before the omnibus came out, and you would have to file to ensure that to kind of show that you didn't finish your work on time. And I think now with the omnibus update, you don't have to submit that anymore. So it means less paperwork, but also a low risk of getting fined. And the auditors will still check this. So I think that's kind of my takeaway for now. I do still think that this requires a more in-depth kind of deep dive by our team to answer this question properly. But thanks for asking. I'm going to spend some time as well after the webinar to explore it a bit better. Right. Let me see if there's other questions in the chat. I see the interview is being shared here. So feel free to also look at the chat. The article was being shared. For now, thanks everyone for joining us today. I also shared here the QR code to our webinar in 2 weeks on the European Deforestation Regulation, which is set to become go into force at the beginning of 2026. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Freddie or to me, Jasper at Coolset or Federica at coolset.com. And we look very much forward to welcome you again soon during our next webinar. Thank you.